If anything is a testament to the inefficacy of conservatism, then it's the unbridled dominance of Marxist ideology in America and in Europe. How did it become like this? The traditional conservative historiography goes like this. America was a traditional country with traditional American values like free enterprise, industriousness, and economic growth, technological progress, and modern civilization, political equality, freedom of speech, liberty, justice, the rule of law, and patriotism. Interwoven with these, they argue, are traditional Christian values, such as the nuclear family, a belief in objective truth, sexual normacy, and piety. American classical liberalism supported the whole of these values, but the illiberal Marxists, in arms with the American left, worked to undermine them, first through the introduction of the welfare state, and through the ideological subversion of cultural Marxism, which precipitated the sexual revolution and the rise of secular materialism. Finally, on the chopping block was the nation-state, which conservatives roughly define as common language, ethnicity, heroes, and history. Some of this historiography is valid. For example, Patrick Buchanan accurately describes the Frankfurt School's ideological influence in America and the long march through the institutions. But what lies unexamined in his book, The Death of the West, which is emblematic of the conservative movement overall, is the degree to which the classical liberal values that conservatives wish to conserve have contributed to the West's decline in tradition. Indeed, this historiography has a major issue. It starts at 1776 and not at the 1st century AD. For conservatism, traditional values are not seen as the basis for the organization of society, but rather they are seen as intellectual food to support an econocentric, wealth-based bourgeois worldview. What conservatives value is chiefly economic growth, and when faced with the modern crisis for that very reason, their recourse is not back to traditional principles nor to traditional forms of rulership that have always acted as the safeguard of religious and sacred values, but their preference is instead toward anything that supports the indefinite growth of capital, no matter how much it enlarges the state, and thus repudiates their love for liberty and for God. The conservative paradigm is therefore fraught with a perilous contradiction. By juxtaposing modern values like political equality, industriousness, and the infinite growth of the free market economy with traditional Christian values, they create a volatile mixture that cannot stay in one form for very long without sublimating something up into the air. Either liberalism wafts up out of the vessel, or Christianity does instead. Nothing could clash against the conservative value of capitalism more than religion. Christianity exhorted its followers to be skeptical of wealth, to reject mammon, and to put the spirit before the world. It was held that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven on account of his attachment to his worldly wealth. The Bible labels usury sin, putting the whole project of finance capitalism, which conservatives uncritically support, into moral condemnation. Christianity has also not supported political equality, for it is always established that the natural pattern of rulership in heaven and on the earth is hierarchical and monarchic, not democratic and not based on the rule of law. Does man get to vote on the word of God? Of course not. Does man's word have sovereignty? No. But it's only by secularizing and dehumanizing rule, and thus disconnecting it from its divine principle, that liberalism was able to conceive of political equality. Therefore, because of the incompatibility of capitalism, liberalism, and traditional Christian values, conservatism was confronted by a choice that defined its very nature, the choice between God and wealth. Conservatism chose wealth, a fact which has had dire consequences. In The Death of the West, Patrick Buchanan highlights one of the most deadly problems that plagues capitalism: demographic winter. Birth rates are in decline, he writes, and in the West, Europeans are falling below replacement rates. In Africa and the Middle East, birth rates are rising. Why is this demographic winter a problem? As Buchanan puts it, the welfare state requires labor and wealth to supply, and if the population of the United States falls, then the socialist economic system will collapse. To avert collapse, it would be necessary to import hordes of foreign people into the US to meet demands for industrial labor, which would lead to the demise of American values through the dissolution of ethnicity and the nation-state. There is, however, a question here that Buchanan sidesteps. Why is it necessary for the economy to infinitely grow? Why not just accept the decline in birth rates and downsize the nation whilst preserving traditional Christian values? His implicit answer to this is twofold. One, he posits that this demographic decline will be like a tailspin, difficult to recover from the more it goes on. It isn't zero population growth, he writes, but zero population. Two, he blames the welfare state almost entirely for posing this dilemma, requiring more and more people to feed its demands. These two answers, though, do not really adequately address the question. Why can't we just downsize? First of all, I find the assertion that declining birth rates ends in zero births to be totally absurd. Even during the absolute nadir of civilization, many populations have survived and recovered. The fall of Rome did not destroy the Italic people. Reproduction is of such basic human nature that, like eating, it requires more energy and will not to do than to do. If society were to truly break down, as in a total economic breakdown, the mass pharmaceutical and contraceptive industry would also break down, so that isn't a concern either. Since sex is a basic and instinctive human function, it would necessarily then lead to having children. To say that the decline of population growth leads to zero population is textbook fear-mongering, and we'll see why Buchanan needs to employ this kind of rhetoric. Second, Buchanan places the chief blame for the necessity of population growth on the welfare state. This is also a bit of sidestepping. The real reason why modern societies need population growth has nothing exclusively to do with the extent of the welfare state. Instead, it's a natural consequence of the industrial and finance-driven economy, contingent on the profit motive, which conservatives support. Almost the whole of the American economy is dependent upon finance for its day-to-day operation and profit. Take, for instance, the public corporation, which is owned by shareholders who hold a portion of the corporation's stocks. The shareholder profits when the price of the stock increases, so it's in his interest and in the company's interest to keep growing indefinitely. If growth halts, then the shareholder begins to lose money, hence the common axiom that a company that isn't growing is dying. Debt is also an important consideration. Companies and the government under modern monetary theory will take out loans with the intention of using them to grow and increase their profits. If they don't grow, then they run the risk of going bankrupt on their loans. When they reach a new echelon of profit, they don't just rest on their laurels, because this would be antithetical to the profit motive. No, instead they take on more and more loans with the aim of growing. All of capitalist society, therefore, is contingent upon constant growth and constant extension of profit. If growth reverses, then the economy as a whole must implode. All of capitalist society, therefore, is contingent upon constant growth and constant extension of profit. If growth reverses, then the economy as a whole must implode. Such is the inherent instability of the system that bourgeois liberalism has built, and which is, according to conservatives, a traditional American value. What this all really boils down to is that the American conservative system cannot survive without the infinite growth of capital, so thus, for Buchanan, it's a necessity that this growth takes place. He cannot accept downsizing because he values, above all, capitalism. This is the reason for his fear-mongering about zero population. He needs to scare the reader into assenting to the system of finance capital, to scare him away from thinking of liberal alternatives. In the conservative mind, there is either socialism or capitalism. Capitalism is on the side of freedom, as in free enterprise and private property, while socialism is on the side of central planning and state ownership or property. But this is a false dichotomy, which is surprising considering how well-read Buchanan is on history. There has always been an exact illiberal antithesis to socialism, and in fact, it is the forces of liberalism, impelled by Freemason revolutionaries who acted to throw it off. This antithesis to socialism was that of monarchical rulership, and even further back, feudal rulership. Buchanan, on the other hand, uncritically accepts the revolution while refusing to acknowledge that the revolution and the capitalism that it spawned paved the black road to socialism. The death of the West is only an identification of the problems that American civilization has caused for itself. We have to call this false dichotomy out. There's no reason at all to suppose that liberal capitalism has a right to represent liberty, freedom, and private property. In the past, private property was all respected as a principle without the need for the free market economy. The whole feudal concept of property was private. The idea of all property held by some public thing, or of all property held by the state, was pretty much unheard of. It took an active Marxist revolution in Russia to upset this fact, leading to the collective farms, the kolkhoz. As libertarian Murray Rothbard stated in The Ethics of Liberty, feudalism and monarchy are, practically, privately owned states. All property under the feudalist system is private. You can find a defense of the feudalist idea of private property even up into the works of aristocrat Léon de Poncins, and practically in the reforms of the Russian Stolypin, who sold the kolkhoz land that were formed after the October Revolution to the bank in order to grant private properties to the landless proletariat, therefore stalling the leftist revolutionary agitation. There's much invective on the conservative right in America against the national debt. Why does it keep rising? Why does no one want to pay it off or introduce austerity measures? Part of the reason is because since everyone, the people, own the debt, no single person is accountable for it. Hans Hermann Hoppe identified in Democracy, the God That Failed, that in monarchic regimes, the phenomenon of an encroaching national debt was not as detrimental to the economic order overall, because the monarch himself was responsible as an individual for the debt. Hence, he had an incentive not to infinitely grow it, and to implement austerity when necessary in order to pay it back. Under democratic conditions, the reverse is true. There is no longer any personal accountability for the debt, therefore, no one has the incentive to pay for it. In combination with the modern monetary theory, which makes growth a function of the total amount of debt that can be taken on, finance capitalism grows wildly out of proportion. The looming issue becomes, what if the government defaults because it can no longer meet the conditions for indefinite economic growth? The result will be the breakdown of the economy and of civilization. Capitalism has created the demographic crisis, making demographic winter an issue in the first place, necessitating growth beyond our means and needs. Hence, questioning it has become fatal in the free market conservative mind. It also begs us to consider whether capitalism is really a system of freedom at all. As I said in one of my previous videos, the capitalist workplace is run like a totalitarian police state, not like a libertarian paradise. The uniformity inherent to any job under capitalism, the alienation, the inhumanness, is as total an opposition to freedom as could ever exist. Capitalism enslaves us to wealth, to labor, and to the universal need to work in every class. Capitalists believe that work is the backbone of civilization, whereas in traditional society, it was known that work left people little time for the essential tasks of civilization, friendship, and citizenship. So the conservative insistence that capitalism is behind the greatness of Western civilization is also a lie. So much of the classicism that, in neoclassical style, it fetishizes and empirically draws its inspiration from, was only made possible by the caste, quote-unquote, parasitism of aristocracy. It was in the academy, the palace, and in the workshop that greatness was to be found, not in the fields and in the dirt. It behooves us to question whether those great works of art would have been possible if, for example, Michelangelo had been a wage slave at Microsoft, pulling himself up by his bootstraps, instead of having been brought up in an aristocratic education and apprenticeship, having had his bootstraps neatly tied by society so he could focus on anything but the banalities of life and of labor. Capitalism, with its insistence on efficiency and economic growth, really leaves no more time left for self-cultivation and excellence, or arete, let alone art. Even in the term arete, the root for the word is aristos, or nobility, the same root as aristocracy. Capitalism also brings us to another crisis in regard to traditional values. By reducing everything to economic considerations under capitalism, it serves to engender the commodification of values, subtracting other more primordial prongs of identity, such as race and virtue. Commodification is fundamentally the conflation of a person's identity with products and brands, and the process by which values are turned into products to be consumed rather than principles to be practiced. You don't have to look very far to find conservatives expressing loyalty to companies and brands rather than to ideals, despite these companies promoting leftist and Marxist values. This leads to a constant source of frustration. Products that have formed the outer form of the American conservative identity, such as trucks, action movies, fashion apparel, and so on, are being constantly redesigned for leftist ends. The companies are repeatedly advancing progressive values, and capitalism keeps getting more and more woke. Capitalism and Marxist ideas become fused. Conservatives are therefore forced to bite the bullet and identify with their antithesis, or to hopelessly boycott virtually everything, disconnecting themselves from the free market economy they cherish. Lost in all this are those traditional values which alone matter, and which should alone define conservatism. Another issue with this commodification is that conservative values get conflated with the consumption of products. For example, you're conservative if you watch The Punisher, or if you smoke Marlboros, not because you desire traditional values. This leads to the dilution of principles, leaving conservatives somewhat confused as to what they really believe. For a lot of conservatives, unironically, they only want to get their brand loyalty back like the good old days. They don't realize that it was their loyalty to capitalism in the first place that led to the erosion of those inner values. Next, I'll put the rule of law under the lens of scrutiny. Rule of law is opposed to the rule of persons. In the past, it was well known that it was persons who held authority, not the law. It was the spirit rather than the letter that governed. It was recognized that all authority is fundamentally personal and that it is individual people who make and enforce laws. The law does not make nor enforce itself. The liberal idea of the rule of law, on the other hand, only served to obscure the personal centers of power, which was of great advantage to those who wished to grow the influence of the central state. Conservatives put all their trust in the idea of the rule of law, enslaving themselves to it and thus putting themselves under the hands of those who are committed to changing laws to facilitate power. We will see later that their obedience to the letter of the Constitution puts them at a profound disadvantage against the left, who have no qualms about changing, reinterpreting, and redefining the Constitution to assert their personal interests. There is no living document. There are living persons who make and interpret the document. Those who forget that essentially make their claims to power forfeit. Here is one of the last taboos for conservatism: race. Like it or not, the lived experience of belonging to a family and having a definite inheritance is a central part of human identity. those who claim to support the family while staying race-blind are essentially giving up the exclusive inheritance that undergirds family stability. Part of the reason why conservatives are so afraid to confront race is because of their liberal priors. The liberals not only gave up the family as the basic unit of the state, trading it for the individual, but they also theoretically denied heritability. According to Rousseau, man is a blank slate. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, and Republicans, wedded to the defense of liberal reactionary values, will never therefore cease the tired refrain that they are the party of Lincoln, that they freed the slaves, and that the Democrats are the real racists. They have to do this because it is part and parcel of liberal political theory. Unwittingly, they agree with the Marxist Franz Boas that race is a social construct, and that racial well-being is only environmental, not inherited. Their only explanation for income equality is therefore sociological. They'll reduce it down to single motherhood in black families, to the racism of reduced expectations, and to the welfare state. They rarely ever ask themselves why the same state of affairs is not common to white people. Because they fail to admit any essentialist racial differences between people, conservatives are stuck in a battle to become more and more like the leftists if they want to remain relevant to the status quo, rather than to, against the tide of progress, assert their values. In adhering to the liberal status quo, they give up their claims to basic empirical truthhood. I will show why this is self-defeating. Part of the reason for conservative race blindness is internalized white guilt. They are implicitly, by reducing down to the commonality of history and geography, accepting responsibility for slavery and for colonialism, and giving ammunition to the theory, made popular by Jared Diamond, that civilizations are determined in their essence by magic dirt, that is, by total accident, not according to the traits of a given people. If conservatives do not accept reparations, for example, and they believe that inequality is socioeconomic and environmental in nature, then they're practically putting themselves in the way of the improvement of the black populations as they in the left understand it. The only way for them to expiate this sin is to make concessions to the left, to put non-whites up on a pedestal, and to let their own identity and heredity sit on the back burner. By doing so, they give up one of the most essential and necessary preconditions for a functioning nation-state, a common people. They try in vain to succeed by stepping back and letting minorities speak for them. But in doing so, they give up the essential reality that conservative, civilizing attitudes are to a large extent only present in the white race. They give up their sovereignty and self-identity, furthering the leftist destruction of the family and practically performing the task of deconstructionism for them. The only way out of this dilemma is for them to stop admitting guilt where there is none. If conservatives would avail themselves of the science and adopt a healthy racism, they'd recognize that it is not at all the fault of white people that there is racial inequality. They would instead understand that racial inequality is a fact of genetics and of nature, not of sociological nor historical causes. A lot of the policies that conservatives abhor, such as the expansion of welfare, are only possible to oppose on this basis. If it is indeed true that black inequality is the result of income inequality, then it would behoove any Christian who isn't outright psychopathic or idolatrous to accept the welfare system and affirmative action for the betterment of the well-being of black people. But if it isn't true, and instead inequality is the result of genetics, then there is no such thing as white guilt at all. There is no reason for white people to accept economic appropriation, as it would never reduce racial inequality, and moreover, the inequality is the fault of nature, not of white people. Conservatives have allowed their enemies to define the discourse in historiography. At first, this did not result in outright anti-white hatred to break through into the mainstream. They earnestly thought that they could make friends with the left by giving in and assuaging their own guilt. But every compromise set a trend, and the left does not compromise in turn on race. Today, it's undeniable that the left and woke capital are against white people. Just look at the media, which is a reflection of what power believes. There are dozens of articles with the same headline, beginning in, quote, "the unbearable whiteness of blank." The predominant strain of thought in academia, postmodernism, reduces the white race to a construct called whiteness, denying any heritability and any legitimacy at all to the white population or to white self-identity, thus enabling the left to carry out an unopposed genocide through replacement migration. Here, we reach a serious oversight in Buchanan's book. The motive behind replacement migration is not only economic, but racial. The left is openly anti-white. They will do anything to prevent whites from having a homeland, including outright replacement. The ADL constantly slanders white people and works to deplatform them, to debank them, and to make living impossible, just because they have white identity. The more conservatives go on without realizing this, the more they reduce everything to the economy, the more they will get outmaneuvered by them who hate them not for their politics, but instead for their race. Therefore, having a healthy sense of race and having a healthy racism is extremely important for conservative victory. It wasn't the left, though, who destroyed racial identity in the first place. It was the classical liberals. As soon as liberalism abolished the caste system, replacing it with class, racism was doomed to failure. Caste comes with the recognition of the difference of human qualities by inheritance. That's baked into the system practically and theoretically. When it was abolished by the Masonic revolutionaries of 1776 and replaced by free enterprise in the class system, the underpinning of hereditary recognition was done away with and replaced only by quantity, by wealth. Now, it's true that racism did survive for a time. The Founding Fathers had a quasi-aristocratic attitude, believing that blacks should be slaves, that they were racially inferior, and so on. There was an Immigration Act passed that allowed in only white immigrants. But the direction of their ideology and the general trend that it set was obvious, and the inevitable consequence of it was the gradual expansion of franchise to different races, the collapsing of racial differentiation, the emancipation of slaves, and eventually anti-racism and anti-white ideology. Kaczynski reminds us that one of the principles of history is that history is governed by general trends. Only long-term trends make a lasting impact and have any staying power. So what's important here in our analysis isn't that the Founding Fathers were a little bit racist or that they had this or that racial law enacted. What matters is the principle and the momentum of that principle. The momentum of all people are created equal and that of the blank slate of Rousseau has carried forward into the future. Conservatives have been therefore completely disarmed. Without the idea of caste, the only difference between individuals is now how much money they make. If people are reducible to the amount of money they make, and if all men are created equal, then there's no just reason why one should have any money over another person. The only logical conclusion is that inequality is a case of exploitation. See the problem with the whole ordeal? The rise of socialism is only a predictable consequence of liberal principles. Those, like the conservatives who wish to cling on to revolutionary liberal principles while cherishing traditional values, really only love nothing. They have dug their own graves. Moreover, on the question of race, Buchanan and the conservatives fail even harder on the most basic observations. To his credit, he points out the fundamental issue of black crime, but he isn't brave enough to figure out why it's happening nor to offer any solutions. This is disappointing considering he name-dropped Jared Taylor in his book, but in any case, this failure to offer any useful elaboration other than to present evidence of a crisis is a running theme throughout Death of the West, demonstrating its intellectual bankruptcy, which stems invariably from its lack of consistent and radical principles. Of all issues the West is facing, race is perhaps the most immediate. Black crime is rising, as he points out. Black and white crime is vastly higher than any other interracial crime. Whites are being victimized by the false leftist paradigm of diversity, but that's not all. Whites are being internally replaced in our own country. The Latino and mixed-race populations are rapidly growing, and by 2056, whites are projected to be a minority in the United States. The Latino population is projected to experience the largest numeric gain during this decade, 11.8 million. However, the population identifying with two or more races is projected to be the fastest-growing racial/ethnic group between 2010 and 2020, with a 36% increase. The Asian American population is projected to increase by 32%, followed by the Latino population, 23%. The non-Hispanic white population is projected to increase by just 1%, with a net gain of 1.3 million people. If the racial problem reaches critical mass, it might look like Zimbabwe, where gangs drove the countryside, ransacking white houses and stealing their property. The gangs will not care if you married a black woman or if you stuck back and let Ye speak for you. It comes down to the basic historical fact that diversity causes conflict. Conservatives do not have an answer to this problem. They hyper-focus on illegal immigration as if that would ever avert demographic change to any conceivable extent. No. There is already a sufficiently large population in the United States of Latinos to outbreed and replace white people. And moreover, much immigration is actually legal rather than illegal, and largely speaking, conservative politicians, populist or not, have been promoting it in order to buttress capitalism in the high-skill sectors of industry. Again, the conservative preference for the growth of capital butts up against traditional conservative values. All that Buchanan recommends is basically end illegal immigration, end H-1B visas, end contraception, put a stop to abortion, and other such trivial nonsense, generally in an effort to outbreed non-white populations by pumping up European birth rates. The basic fact is, white people will never outbreed non-white populations due to differences in delayed gratification. We will never win the quantity game. Whites are comparatively more K-selected. We have a slower life history. We have fewer offspring, but put more investment into them than other races. Our reproductive strategy is simply not as competitive. Outbreed the East is, and never will be, realistic. Whites have always been a world minority with outsized influence owing to our special traits. The only feasible option, therefore, is not to become the majority, but instead to institute separatism, as the white race has done in the past. But since Buchanan is awfully silent on race as a criterion for the nation-state, he never presents this option. Conservatives show their timidity, their lack of tradition, their fundamentally revolutionary point of view from the perspective of Western traditionality once again. It was conservatives who helped overthrow segregation, supporting the verdict in Brown v. Board of Education. It was conservatives who gave birth to Lincoln, no matter how much they waved the Dixie flag. Conservatives today have such a split mind that at once they wave a symbol of the racial state, then contend that they are not and should not be racist. They want to preserve their heritage, but they reduce the question of heritage to a handful of statues of political bygones who do not even represent their modern conservative values. Conservatism thus throws away the only weapon it has in the fight, as it always seems to do. Moreover, on the question of demographic winter, I already proposed the third option in the false dichotomy: allow the decline and use it as a constructive opportunity to downsize and institute traditional values and ways of life, to throw off capitalism and embrace tradition. But there is another option that he does not want to consider, but which, from the industrialist point of view, is the natural and obvious conclusion. If you can't increase the quantity of a population, you must needs increase its quality. Indeed, Buchanan does not at all consider the possibility of eugenics laws, of breeding high IQ whites together, of harnessing the power of the modern state to increase the productivity of the population. I'm not saying that this is a good or even a preferable solution. I present this alternative only to expose the paucity and cowardice of Buchanan's thinking. Lastly, we arrive at the final boss for conservatism: Israel and Zionism. Throughout the book, Buchanan stresses Judeo-Christian values, as if the racial supremacy espoused in the Torah is at all compatible with the maintenance of a white, conservative, Christian heritage, and as if the old law should take precedence over the new one. In reality, you can't merge the Pharisees and the Christians together. You can't put new wine in old wineskins. The Bible is rife with examples of this, but tell me how Judeo-Christianity is the future. The question of Israel is also prominent. If conservatives stress small government, non-intervention, and the sovereignty of the people and the nation-state, then they are hypocrites if they support Israel and the Zionist politicians who have split national interests. In Congress, a vast number of representatives have dual citizenship with Israel. A lot of conservative politicians are funded by Israeli organizations like AIPAC. Israel gets to essentially determine American policy. The interests of the American people have nothing to do with those of Israel. Israel is involved in a permanent war in the Middle East, ergo, siding with them necessitates interventionism and arms trade. The US has enough problems at home: the gradual collapse of economic well-being, racial conflict, and mass immigration. Why must it concern itself with the well-being of a Middle Eastern country thousands of miles away? The convergence of American conservatism and Zionism is the most puzzling phenomenon of all, and I don't see why conservatives ought to support it. The real program of conservatism in America is this: identify a crisis, identify the solution, then reject the solution because it's illiberal. Every single time. All it does is compromise with the enemy, playing on the enemy's field, letting it define what conservatism is. When will conservatives learn that if they want traditional values, or if they want any kind of victory at all, they absolutely must become illiberal? Bronze Age Pervert says you will get 99% of what you want if you just elect Buchanan or Ann Coulter. I say instead that every crisis that afflicts conservatism could be solved if they would just unelect liberalism. Indeed, the left keeps trying to redefine what the Constitution is to its advantage. Why are conservatives too cowardly to do the same? Decline of religion and family, reject the separation of church and state, and reinstate Christian moral law. Leftist infiltration in the First Amendment, ban leftism from elections, and censor the publication of leftist ideas. Kick Marxists out of university. Black and white crime, and the 14th Amendment and separate. Immigration crisis, tell the financiers to heck off and close the borders. Labor crisis, and the 13th Amendment. To Buchanan's credit, he realizes this, almost. He's very, very close to realizing what conservatism needs to succeed. He recommends that states utilize obscenity laws to censor the left, to end sex education, and to put a stop to the sexual revolution. But obviously that won't go far enough. It can't root out critical theory and postmodernism from academia, nor will it be able to reach the highest halls of American authority. If he isn't willing to take the use of authority in the culture war seriously and radically, what use does it even have? Again, he's stuck here compromising with liberal values, which is akin to him just butting his head up against a wall uselessly. The situation that American conservatism has here is like the metaphor that Kaczynski uses to represent reform of the system. Imagine that there's a strong man and a weak man. They both have property. The weak man wants more property, so he comes to the strong man and demands it. The strong man is too cowardly to fight back, so he gives away some property. This keeps happening over and over again until the strong man no longer has any property. That's how the conservative force here works in America, due to the insane adherence that it has for liberal values. Keep compromising on the same values that destroyed the traditional world over and over again until you own nothing and are unhappy. Now, we've established that conservatives have failed in a number of ways. First of all, their ideology is contradictory. They want to hold on to both traditional and revolutionary principles at the same time, but something has to give. 2, what they let give way wasn't the revolution, but instead traditional principles, which are for the most part illiberal and anti-capitalistic. They valued economic growth and capitalism to such an extent they let it get away from them and dispose of traditional values. 3, their revolutionary liberal values have failed to avail them of a sane and traditional view on race, which has led to a demographic crisis of another kind than pure numbers, total racial conflict. 4, they're so dedicated to the weakness of liberal values that they fail to see the very practical fact that their success requires them to become illiberal. 5, their liberal priors have inured them to a race-blind ideology that is causing them to rapidly lose their heritage. 6, they've entered into an unholy alliance with the Zionists. All of this prevents them from taking victory. But what should victory look like? I'll advance the argument that what conservatives really want is not to be found in liberal, capitalist society, but instead in the feudal society of the past ages. I've already explained the fact that feudal society is essentially private government with private property, but we can expand on this. Feudalism is essentially family government. Conservatives complain that leftists aim at demolishing society, and as Buchanan rightly notes in his book, promote atomized individualism, which is more responsive to the whims of state control. The leftist program is essentially to break down regional power centers and to let the centralized state fill the power vacuum. But it isn't the left alone who is to blame for the breakdown of the family. Conservatives will say that the family is the basic building block of society. That was true in feudal times. Power was hereditary, land and titles were hereditary and granted through marriage, aristocracy was in the blood. The family had a natural hierarchy. The father was the king, the patriarch. The mother was the queen, a supporting and nurturing figure. Below them were the children, who were to inherit those roles and continue the family legacy. The family itself was a mirror of the divine hierarchy. There's a certain continuity and resemblance between God the Father, the regal patriarch, and the familial patriarch. Family, then, was therefore crucial to the feudal and traditional concept of government. But today, the statement, the family is the basic unit of society, is just a pointless axiom that makes conservatives feel better about their atomized liberal capitalist society. It is now in post-revolutionary times not the family, but the individual who is the basic unit of society. This fact was encapsulated in the thinking of John Locke and Rousseau, and its basic spirit is evident in the American myth of the rugged individual. If liberal capitalism really respected the family, then it wouldn't have sent wives to work, it wouldn't have left dads without time to see their sons, it wouldn't have subsumed the task of education to the state rather than leaving it in the hands of the patriarch. It wouldn't have replaced the farm with the factory. In fact, Buchanan pointed out that agricultural life was far more conducive to the family, so he had at least some intuition that industrial society robs the family of its place. Ultimately, even before the influence of the left on America, the family had already been stripped of its importance, and it was only a matter of time until that residual runoff was able to complete its journey into the revolutionary Masonic toilet bowl. Conservatives have unconsciously assented to this. They believe in everything that breaks apart the human family. They believe in the factory, in the school, in the prison, and all other accoutrements and externalities of modern capitalism that take the basic tasks of the patriarch, provision, education, and discipline away, thereafter transporting it to the state. Another thing that conservatives cherish is liberty, and they're not wrong to. Liberty and human autonomy are central parts of what it means to be human. Having the freedom to exert your will, to act, to exercise our God-given freedom. But what conservatives don't understand is that freedom reaches not its zenith, but its nadir under liberal democracy. Bertrand de Jouvenel pointed out the fact that in history, the emancipation of the people from power has always, in fact, led to a greater enslavement of people to power. When the social controls and master class gives out, when the people are emancipated from them, the result is always to hand the people over to the will of the centralized and unlimited state. Tyranny is inevitable. When feudalism fell and sovereignty began to be based on the principle of popular will rather than on the divine right of kings, the result was the rise of absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchs emancipated people from aristocratic dominion, making them direct subjects of the king rather than the subjects of so many barons. Plebeians were given positions in the royal courts. Monarchs would convene plebiscites to let them vote on policy, and so on. But the result of this emancipation was the expansion of the monarch's authority, his access to the country's resources and human capital. One example of this is the phenomenon of conscription. In ancient and feudal times, there was never enough state power to enforce conscription on a massive scale. There were no standing armies in feudal times except for small forces of expensive mercenaries and tiny private retinues. There weren't typically even massive police forces. To conduct war, a king would have to beseech his vassals and ask him for support, which would only be for about 40 days or so. However, after the rise of absolutism, men fell under the direct authority of the king, taxation was possible to be expanded and intensified, and so there was both the rise, for the first time, of large standing armies and even larger forces of conscripts. In the feudal age, the largest battles were perhaps among 20,000 or so men. In the age of absolutism, they could number into the millions. Such was the price of emancipation and freedom. The story of the Revolution of 1789 is no different. When the Ancien regime was overthrown, then came the tyrant Napoleon with his terrible wars, his censorship, and his strict code of laws. Likewise, the Revolution of 1776 saw the rise of a military might so formidable that it was able to force men into service to fight the least popular war the country had ever seen, Vietnam. Even before then, the human and industrial capital that was possible for the United States to command into action during World War II was unprecedented. Today, we are seeing the fruits of democratic emancipation from the crown, ever greater managerialism, the gradual quashing of speech under the Civil Rights Act, macromanaging of everyday affairs, forced association, reparations and racial expropriation, a code of law growing so obese from precedent and trickery that it requires, practically, the equivalent of the entire state of Israel to interpret. If you want to see what the extreme end of human emancipation looks like, then look no further than the USSR. The result was not the freeing of the proletariat from their capitalist masterclass, but instead the mass industrial enslavement of man by the technocratic elite. Whenever you emancipate the low from the middle, you just turn them into the slaves of the high. Liberalism, in terms of its historical position, is just one revolutionary stepping stone below the USSR, and it was the emancipation of 1776 that put us in this perilous position. We are in the spot of a man who, after having traversed a minefield to get a better vantage point on the enemy, can only see more clearly what peace he has left behind and the far greater terrors that lie before him. If he stays put, he will be outmaneuvered and finished off. If he tries to go back, he might get blown up. If he pushes forward, he will come out of cover and get shot. Conservatives would like to stay put while the enemy encroaches around him. All these various modern and postmodern ideologies urge us to push forward with the lust for death, the death of all that we value. The only way to survive is back where we came, carefully. It might be risky, but at least there's a chance. Some might say that we could push forward, armed with the technical prowess of the 21st century, but to do so would eliminate what humanity and autonomy we have. The belief that we can use eugenics, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and cybernetics to outcompete the elite is dumb for a few reasons. In the first place, it requires that we give up our sacred humanity, which entails giving up what is most central to us. Second, it would place upon us the need to follow the demon of necessity wherever it goes. It places us in an arms race with the world, thus forcing us to adopt the world's global values. This is part of the impetus behind the development of such technology. Competition will breed globalist assimilation. We must avoid this at any cost. This brings us then to the essential problem with the conservative mindset. Their love for economic and technical progress inures them to a progressive and globalized worldview, if only they would realize that. If they really cared about their values, they would be against the technological society. They would feel closer to Kaczynski than they would to Buchanan. Ultimately, liberty is not to be found at all in the current system except in some sort of ephemerality. The current system and its weakness, its inability to avert the long march through the institutions and the slow, creeping encirclement of leftist forces cannot stand. Modern and postmodern systems aim to become the anti-traditional and statocratic masters of absolute secular power, and so for conservatives, that is a no-go. The only way to preserve liberty, private property, and traditional values both is back to some form of feudalism. But I recognize that this exhortation has some problems. Where is the new stock of kings? Who would become the aristocracy? How could this even organically come about? Would it have to be instituted by some group or individual? How would he be a proper judge of what constitutes aristocratic values? These are questions that are worthy in their own right and worth addressing at another time. The easiest answer is that such a thing can emerge out of conservative Catholicism. There are also more complex possibilities, but regardless of how practical feudalism may or may not be, this is a question of principle, not of practical specificity. But until that time, when such ideals can be realized, conservatives might be able to consider a form of illiberal and anti-capitalist nationalism. Nationalism based on race and the nation-state, not on ethnicity or common heroes alone. It should be anti-capitalist, anti-industrialist, and founded on traditional values. There's an ideology like this, you can figure it out, which is great in practice even if it isn't in principle. That alone can make up for the weakness in the illiberal conservative paradigm.